She was drowning in the river along with her car. A man jumped into the icy water and pulled her ashore. But when the woman looked at his face, she realized she had known him for 8 years. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The rain had been falling for 3 days without pause, first in thin streaks that streaked the glass with silver threads, and then in heavy sheets that seemed to dissolve the horizon itself. Along the mountain highway, the world looked drowned, as though the very air had thickened into water. The cliffs rose steep and dark to one side, their faces slick with moss and rivulets of runoff. While on the other side, the guardrail bent precariously over a drop, so sheer that the white roar of the river below could be heard even through the storm. Cars rarely ventured this road when the weather turned violent, and the few that did were swallowed quickly by mist, reduced to trembling red points of light that soon vanished into the wet twilight. Rebecca gripped the wheel of her sedan with both hands, her knuckles pale against the black leather. She was exhausted, too exhausted to think clearly, but still she pressed forward, the tires hissing on the slick pavement. Her mind churned faster than the swollen river below. A day packed with meetings, messages unanswered on her phone, promises to her sister she hadn't kept. Bills waiting on the counter at home. Every thought piled onto the next in restless urgency. The glow of her dashboard clock told her she was later than she had planned. She should have stopped long ago, found a motel before the weather closed in completely, but the idea of a strange room and stale sheets only made her foot press harder on the accelerator. The road curved, a thin strip of black winding along the cliff face. Her headlights struck the warning sign, "Sharp curve ahead." Its yellow paint blurred by rain. She registered it too late. Her hands jerked the wheel, and for a breathless instant the car clung to the wet surface. Then the tire slipped. The sickening skid sent the vehicle sideways. The sound of steel, meeting steel, shattered the air as the guardrail gave way, its bolts screeching from their moorings. The world turned upside down. The car lifted, hung in the air, then plunged. Rebecca's scream tore from her throat and was swallowed by the storm. The impact with the rocks below came like the strike of a giant's fist. Glass shattered, the hood crumpled, the airbags burst open in clouds of choking dust. The car slammed once, then tipped, sliding toward the raging water. The river welcomed it with a hiss, and suddenly the world outside her windows was liquid and furious. The first rush of icy water made her gasp. It gushed through the cracks, flooding the floorboards, soaking her shoes, rising fast toward her knees. She clawed at the seatbelt buckle, but her fingers shook too much to grip it properly. She tried again. The taste of panic flooding her mouth as the water climbed. The car rocked with the current, dragged away from the shore, twisted by the relentless pull of the swollen river. Her headlights glowed weakly beneath the murk, ghostly beams wavering like dying stars. Rebecca's breaths came short and sharp. The water was at her waist now, the cold burning into her skin like needles. She beat her palms against the glass, tried to push the door, but the outside pressure held it shut. She screamed for help, though she knew the storm and the river would drown her voice. The dashboard lights flickered, a pitiful pulse in the drowning machine. Her heart hammered in her chest, and in those moments, she thought of everything at once. Her mother's face, her unfinished projects, the bitter arguments she'd never resolved. The water rose higher, reached her chest, her throat. Tears mixed with the icy flood, her lungs tightening as terror closed around her like a second skin. Far above, on the highway, another pair of headlights cut through the mist. A battered pickup crawled along the slick curve, its wipers squealing across the glass. Behind the wheel sat a man alone. Jack had been driving this road for hours, the rhythm of the rain his only companion. He preferred nights like this, when the world was empty, when no one expected him to stop or explain himself. Silence was the armor he had worn for 8 years, and he carried it the way some men carried weapons. But as he rounded the bend, something caught his eye, a brief flash of unnatural light below. He slowed, leaned forward, and through the mist he saw it. Faint beams flickering under the surface of the river, like trapped fireflies drowning. His body stiffened, his chest constricted. He knew that sight too well. A car in the water. Someone inside. For an instant, every instinct screamed for him to keep driving, to let the river take what it had claimed. He had sworn never again, never to throw himself back into the chaos that had once defined him, never to listen to the cries of the helpless, because he had already given everything and lost more than he could bear. But the hesitation lasted only seconds. His foot slammed the brake, his truck fishtailed before shuddering to a stop on the narrow shoulder. He flung the door open, the storm lashing at his face as he stumbled toward the edge. The descent was treacherous. Wet rocks shifted under his boots, his palms skinned raw as he slid down the slope toward the churning river. He saw the car now, its roof just visible, the windows dark but for the pale oval of a woman's face pressed against the glass. Her eyes were wide with terror. The current tugged the vehicle deeper, as though eager to finish the work it had begun. Jack's jaw tightened. The roar of the water filled his ears, but beneath it he heard something else, the memory of another night, another river, the screams of children, the red lights of an overturned bus. He forced the memory back, clenched his fists, and prepared himself for the plunge. His body still remembered how to move, how to calculate the angle, how to time the strike against the current. The river swallowed him in a heartbeat. The cold was so fierce, it felt like his chest had been stabbed. He fought for breath, fought for control, forced his arms and legs to cut through the dark water. The current spun him sideways, slammed him into submerged rocks, but he pushed forward, eyes locked on the sinking car. Each second stretched like an eternity as he drove his body closer to the drowning vehicle, closer to the life trapped inside. Rebecca felt her lungs seize. The water was at her chin now, her head pressed back against the seat as she struggled to keep her mouth above the surface. Her arms thrashed weakly, numb from the cold. Her vision blurred. She thought she saw movement outside, a dark figure fighting through the torrent. But the water burned her eyes, and she couldn't trust what she saw. Still, something within her stirred a final flicker of desperate hope. And then the glass near her shoulder cracked. A fist, a stone, she couldn't tell. A second blow, and the window burst inward, shards scattering like stars in the murky flood. Water roared through the gap, dragging her sideways, but strong hands reached inside, seized her arm. For a moment she resisted, too shocked to understand. Then the grip tightened, insistent, pulling her through the opening into the chaos of the river itself. Her body collided with another's, solid, anchoring, fighting the current with relentless force. Her chest burned as her mouth filled with water. She coughed violently, choking, but the stranger's hold never faltered. Together, they were wrenched free of the sinking car, now disappearing completely beneath the waves. The river tried to tear them apart, spinning them into its deadly embrace, but he pushed forward, kicking against the pull, dragging her inch by inch toward the faint outline of the bank. The storm howled above them. The cliffs loomed like watchful giants. And the river, swollen with rain and fury, sought to claim them both. But Jack did not let go. The storm did not relent. Rain hammered down with the same merciless persistence as the river that roared beneath it, as if the heavens themselves sought to wash the earth clean of everything that clung to its surface. Jack's body cut through the current with the memory of an old rhythm, a rhythm he had once known so well that it had become instinct. The weight of the woman in his grasp was not light, nor was the fight against the torrent forgiving, but the muscles in his arms and chest remembered. He had been here before in different waters, under different skies, carrying different lives that had once trusted him to be strong enough to keep them from death. He had promised himself he would never do this again, never return to the water's cruel embrace. And yet here he was, compelled by something greater than his fear. Rebecca's body felt limp at times, jolted only when a surge of current pulled her violently against him. Her hair plastered across her face, her eyes fluttered between terror and fading consciousness, and her lips parted as she coughed up the river that had invaded her lungs. Jack adjusted his hold, shifting her higher against his chest, forcing her head above the surface with every ounce of his remaining strength. The car that had been her prison moments before was gone now, dragged down into the depths, its fading glow swallowed by the darkness below. He felt the river's pull, trying to steal her from his arms. The current wrapped around his legs, tugging him toward a cluster of rocks, where water churned in whirlpools, sharp with hidden edges. He fought sideways, angling his body, kicking hard against the drag. Every movement was a battle, every stroke of his arm a defiance of the river's hunger. His breath came ragged, the taste of mud and iron filling his mouth each time he surfaced for air. His vision blurred, his chest ached from the cold, but the thought of letting go never once crossed his mind. The bank was far, farther than he had estimated when he leapt from the rocks, but a jagged outline of tree roots and slick stones finally broke through the haze of rain ahead. He forced his legs to propel them closer, ignoring the fire that spread through his muscles. A wave struck them sideways, nearly tearing Rebecca from him, and his heart lurched as her head dipped under. With a desperate burst of strength, he hauled her up again, her body coughing violently against his shoulder, water streaming from her mouth. At last, his hand brushed against something solid, an outcropping of rock that jutted like a sentinel from the shore. He hooked his arm around it, clinging as the current battered him from behind. For a moment, he pressed his cheek against the cold stone, gathering his breath before shifting Rebecca higher and reaching for another hold. Slowly, inch by inch, he dragged them out of the water, his boots finding purchase on roots slick with moss. The bank rose steep and treacherous, but the feel of earth beneath his knees was enough to fill him with grim determination. He heaved Rebecca onto the stones, her body limp as a rag, and collapsed beside her. His chest heaved, each breath a knife, his arms trembling from exhaustion. The rain pelted their faces, relentless, but it no longer mattered. They had escaped the river's claim. For a moment, the world narrowed to the sound of his own heart, hammering against his ribs, and the gasping coughs of the woman beside him. She convulsed, choking on water, before a stream of it spilled from her lips. Her body shuddered violently, then drew in a jagged, wheezing breath. Jack pressed his hand to her back, forcing her to roll slightly onto her side so the water could drain more easily. He kept his other hand against the earth, anchoring himself to the reality of the moment, fighting the ghosts that tried to claw their way into his mind. He had done this before. How many times? But always there had been others around him. Always the shouting, the lights, the chaos of rescue. Tonight there was only the storm, the river, and the two of them, small figures swallowed by the mountain's shadow. Minutes stretched into eternity before her coughing eased. Her breaths came shallow, but they were steady. She lay with her eyes closed, lashes heavy with water, her chest rising and falling with fragile rhythm. Jack sat back on his heels, pressing a hand against his thigh to still its trembling. His own body ached, his lungs burned, and every muscle screamed at him to rest, but his gaze never left her face. He needed to know she was alive, that the river had not won. When she stirred at last, lifting her head slightly, her eyes opened to reveal a dazed confusion. She blinked against the rain, her lips trembling as she tried to orient herself. Jack leaned closer, instinctively shielding her with his body from the worst of the downpour. She looked at him then, really looked, her gaze fixing on his face, on the sharp lines carved by years of solitude and pain, on the wet strands of hair plastered to his forehead, on the scar that ran jagged along his forearm where his sleeve had been shoved back by the current. Something in her expression shifted, but it was fleeting, lost to the haze of shock and exhaustion. Jack turned his eyes away, unable to endure the searching intensity of her gaze. He forced himself to focus instead on the task at hand. They were not safe yet. The river was still at their backs, the storm still raging above. He rose slowly, his knees stiff, and scanned the bank for higher ground. A cluster of trees leaned over the slope, not far from where they had collapsed. He could already imagine the roots forming a crude shelter against the wind. Gathering what strength remained, he bent and lifted her into his arms again. She groaned softly, but did not resist, her head falling against his shoulder. Step by careful step, he climbed the incline, his boots slipping on the wet stones, his breath ragged. The world seemed reduced to the weight in his arms, the rhythm of his own heartbeat, and the ceaseless hiss of rain. At the top of the bank, under the shelter of the trees, he lowered her onto the ground once more. She curled instinctively against the trunk, shivering. Jack crouched beside her, watching, ensuring she remained conscious. His hands itched to build a fire, to create warmth, but there was no chance of flame in this deluge. All he could offer was his presence, the steady watch of a man unwilling to leave her side until he was certain she would live. Time blurred into a long stretch of silence, broken only by the storm's voice. Rebecca's breathing steadied, little by little, though tremor still rippled through her body. She opened her eyes occasionally, glancing at him as though trying to form words, but none came. Jack did not press. He understood that the body sometimes needed longer than the mind to return from the edge of death. For Jack, the silence was filled with echoes. He could not sit there without remembering. The weight of her against him as he fought the river was too familiar, too close to the memories he had tried to bury. Another river, another rescue. The sound of children screaming as water swallowed steel. The impossible choices made in seconds that would haunt him for a lifetime. He had run from that night, hidden himself from a world that once praised him as a hero, but the cost had been his own heart. And yet here he was, dragged back into the same current, compelled to fight for a stranger's life. He clenched his fists against the flood of thoughts. This was not then. This was now. She was alive. That was enough. The rain eased at last, thinning to a mist that clung to the leaves. A pale hint of dawn pressed against the clouds, washing the sky with dim gray. The river below still roared, but its voice was less furious, as if even it had grown weary of the struggle. Jack's body ached with exhaustion, but his senses remained sharp, honed by years of survival. He knew that when the sun rose fully, they would have to move, to climb back toward the road, to seek help. But for now, in the fragile calm after the storm, he allowed himself a moment of stillness. Beside him, Rebecca stirred again. Her eyes opened wider this time, more awareness in them, though still clouded by fatigue. She looked at him as though searching for something she could not yet name. Jack met her gaze briefly, then turned it toward the river, unwilling to let her see the depth of what lingered behind his own eyes. They had survived the night. That was all that mattered. But deep within, Jack knew that this meeting, born in the fury of water and storm, was not over. Something had begun on that riverbank, something he could not yet define, but it pulled at him with the same inexorable force as the current he had fought to escape. The storm had delivered her into his arms, and though he tried to tell himself it was chance, some part of him whispered that fate had reached for him again, refusing to let him hide any longer. The pale gray of dawn crept slowly through the tangle of wet branches above them. The storm had passed, but its memory lingered in every drop that fell from the leaves, in every hiss of water streaming down the slope toward the river. The earth smelled of mud and rain, heavy and raw, and the river's voice, though quieter than in the night, still echoed like a warning that it would never forget what it had tried to claim. Jack sat against the rough bark of a tree, his body stiff and aching, his breath steadying at last after the endless battle of the night. Beside him, Rebecca stirred again, her lashes trembling as her eyes blinked open to the new light. For the first time since he had pulled her from the water, her gaze held more clarity, as though the fog that had shrouded her mind was thinning. She turned her face slightly toward him. The morning painted his features in muted tones, the rugged lines carved deeper by years of solitude, the stubble on his jaw still wet with rain, the scar along his forearm visible where his sleeve had torn in the struggle. Her eyes lingered on that mark, drawn to it as if by instinct. Something in her memory cracked open like ice, breaking on the river. And images she had not expected to surface came rushing back with painful clarity. A night 8 years past, the roar of another river, the screaming of children, the chaos of twisted metal and shattered glass. She remembered the terror of her daughter slipping beneath the surface, remembered the desperate hands that had pulled the child back into the world of the living. She remembered the rescuer's arm, marked by the very same scar now before her eyes. Her breath caught, and for a moment she thought she must be mistaken, that the mind could play cruel tricks in the haze of trauma. But the more she looked at him, the more the recognition solidified, until it was undeniable. The man beside her, the stranger who had thrown himself into the storm to save her life, was the same man she had sought for years without success, the hero who had vanished after saving her child, leaving only questions and silence in his wake. Jack felt the intensity of her gaze, but did not return it. He had seen that look before, years ago, in the eyes of those who had been pulled from the brink, and tried to understand why one man had chosen to bear the weight of their survival. He shifted slightly, turning his attention outward, as though the river below held some secret he needed to guard. But inside, his chest tightened. He knew what she had seen. He had carried the knowledge of that scar as a brand, an unshakable reminder of the night his life had shattered. Rebecca's lips parted, but no words came. The weight of recognition filled the space between them heavier than the storm had been. She understood now why he had seemed both familiar and distant, why his presence carried the authority of a man who had fought with water before. Gratitude swelled within her. But so did sorrow, for she could see in the hollows of his eyes that the rescue of her daughter had cost him something immeasurable. Jack shifted, resting his hands against his knees, his shoulders taut. The silence stretched long until finally, with a voice low and roughened by both exhaustion and memory, he spoke. He did not tell her his name. He did not need to. Instead, his words were simple acknowledgments of what she already knew. He told her that he had not intended for anyone to recognize him, that he had left that life behind for reasons she could not begin to imagine, that he had lived these years alone because solitude was easier than remembering. Rebecca listened, her heart tightening with each word. She thought of her daughter, now older, vibrant and strong, living because of him. She had spent so long wishing to find the man who had saved her child, longing to thank him, to tell him that his act of courage had not been forgotten. Yet now that he sat beside her, she realized that gratitude alone would never be enough. He carried grief so heavy it pressed through every word he spoke. The story of his past came haltingly, fragments woven through silence. He told of the night in Seattle, of the bus that had careened into the river, of the desperate cries that had filled the air. He told her that he had pulled her daughter from the water, but that in doing so, he had lost sight of his own wife and the unborn son she had carried. He had chosen in seconds which lives he could reach, and in that choice had lost the ones he loved most. The river had taken them, and though the world called him a hero, he could not bear the title. To him, it wasn't heroism, but failure. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears, her chest tightening with both sorrow and a fierce desire to undo his pain, though she knew she could not. She understood now why he had vanished, why no one had ever been able to find him. He had not wanted to be found. He had buried himself in silence and distance, trying to outpace the memory that clung to him like the current itself. But fate had brought them together again, on another river, under another storm. She told him that her daughter lived a life full of promise, that not a day passed without the story of her rescue being remembered. She told him that though he had lost, he had also given, and that gift had grown into a life filled with meaning. She spoke softly, knowing that words could not erase grief, but perhaps could remind him that sacrifice was not in vain. Jack listened, though his eyes remained fixed on the river. Her words pressed against the walls he had built around himself, and though he wanted to resist them, he felt the cracks forming. For the first time in years, he allowed the thought that perhaps what he had given had mattered, that perhaps his suffering had not been only an ending, but also a beginning for someone else. The sun began to rise, breaking through the clouds at last, casting pale gold across the river's restless surface. The light touched their faces, warming them slightly, and in that moment, a fragile stillness settled. Jack turned to meet her eyes at last, and what he saw there was not pity, not condemnation, but recognition and something deeper, an understanding that bound them together in ways neither had expected. They sat there in silence, the river flowing on, carrying with it the echoes of the past. The storm had changed them both. For Rebecca, it was the discovery of the man she had searched for, the chance to finally give the gratitude she had carried for so long. For Jack, it was the beginning of something he had not thought possible, the faint stirring of release, of a life no longer defined only by loss. As the day broke fully, they rose together, unsteady but alive. The climb back to the road would be hard, their bodies weakened by the night's ordeal, but neither faced it alone. Each step forward was a quiet defiance of the river that had tried to take them. Each step was also a bridge between past and present, between grief and possibility. The river had sought to drown them both, but in its failure, it had given them something greater. It had given them recognition, the truth of their intertwined fates, and the fragile promise that even the deepest wounds could be carried together. They walked slowly, side by side, toward the waiting road, leaving behind the bank where silence had finally broken, where grief had met gratitude, and where a man who had hidden from the world began at last to return to it. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch the next video waiting for you right now. There are many more stories worth discovering. And don't forget to share this video with friends and family. Some journeys are too meaningful to keep to yourself.